What do you do to relieve stress when you're playing video games?
I get up and sit down.
Hey, what's up, guys? Me, Steve. Yeah. We got a little problem.
Well, the programmers have assured us that they think they can get a quick fix on it. They think they know what the problem is.
A training video called "This is Sega Test" is being shown to new game testers. Lead testers guide the cameras around their office, walking them through the testing process, the Jolt Cola in the break room, a rare inside look at their scarce Sophia dev units and 32X EEPROMs. At the very end of the roughly half-hour production, we get a panning view of SOA's warehouses. Gaze at stacks upon stacks of Game Gear bundles, Genesis boxes, and piles of inventory. Though unbeknownst to those who watched This is Sega Test, many of the boxes shown here would never move. Millions of games and systems, and the vast majority are not being ordered by retailers. It's April 1996. This nearly 300-page confidential document, put into the hands of an unknown Sega insider, shows a staggering hoard of unordered inventory, the critical failure of 2 consecutive console launches, regret and despair over games in development, wishful marketing strategies after budgets got slashed, a pie-in-the-sky Saturn game release calendar listing at least 80 games that would later get canceled, communication troubles with the Japanese headquarters, and utterly tortuous financial strain. All at a time when their chief competitor strikes hot iron while Sega is busy treating its broken limbs. This is Sega FY1997, revealing a ghost that would haunt the Blue Giant for years. Let's travel slightly further back in time. May 11th, 1995, E3.
Real fast.
Optic nerve here. I am gonna need some help.
Real painful.
So get your rods and cones ready. Our advertising is very different.
Tom Kalinske is making some promises about the Saturn to the video game industry.
More than 100 third parties are now developing Sega Saturn software for 1995.
This first line might technically be true. If he means more than 100 third parties are currently developing Saturn games, then that's plausible. But many of those third parties would later cancel their games.
And we anticipate a full library of 80 outstanding third-party titles on retail shelves by Christmas of this year.
That did not happen. Just 47 games came out in time for Christmas, and about 30 are third-party games, not including Sega away team titles.
We're at retail today in 1,800 Toys R Us, software, etc., and electronic boutique stores around the U.S. and Canada.
This also seems far-fetched. It took many months for every major region to get Saturn consoles in stores.
We have 10 software titles at retail in the next few days.
Few days? Try a few months. The US wouldn't get 10 Saturn games until August 17th, more than 3 months after Tom said this.
20 by August.
Likewise, they did not get 20 games out until October 3rd. So already, we're starting off Saturn's North American run in less than good fashion.
It's out there.
But as of E3, no one really knew these forecasts from Tom were wrong. Spectators went into E3 thinking Saturn would come out on September 2nd. We know now that if it did, they could have feasibly released more than 20 games at launch. Instead, Kalinske announced the Saturn would launch today at $399 to get the jump on Sony's PlayStation.
Look for Sega Saturn.
It launched early with just 6 games, leaving a nearly 3-month game drought before the next game came out. Right after his speech, Sony announced PlayStation would launch in September at $299. An effective punch. On the E3 show floor, this poster showed Saturn games that are coming for Christmas of 1995. Some exciting stuff here. Castlevania, Parodius, Legacy of Kain, Descent, The 11th Hour. Now, all those games I just named would later get canceled. Some of the games on this list only released in other regions, and others never came out at all. Another massive chunk would not come out in time for Christmas, like Darkstalkers and Primal Rage. The holiday shopping season is critical, and the promises they're making for the holidays will be broken.
At Best Buy, you'll find lots of great gifts.
We already knew that, generally, PlayStation far outsold the Saturn during North America's 95 holiday season. We knew their previous console launch, the 32X, did not go well, immediately fizzling out.
There is no 32-bit Super NES.
We knew the 16-bit market slumped tremendously by 95 and 96, despite SOA still focusing heavily on the Genesis. It was already clear that Sega of America was not doing well financially, but we did not know it was this bad. It's not clear who Sega FY1997 originally belonged to. Much of it appears to center around getting ready for E3 1996, preparing games and hardware to show off on the floor. It lays out Sega Saturn's lackluster launch with the overall goal of using this year to spark a comeback. Decades go by, this binder finds its way to eBay in 2021. A person who goes by Golden Dreamcast tells us they came across FY1997 while scrolling for Sega development hardware. The listing said, "Vintage Sega Game Development Brand Review Binder from former employee." He bought it for a few $100s, bought a scanner, scanned it, and sent the PDF to Forest of Illusion for an organized drop. But Forest of Illusion later disbanded, so Golden Dreamcast said to hell with it, I'm uploading this myself. He put it on Internet Archive in July of 2023. We are fortunate this was put in the hands of someone who cares about preserving video game history instead of some private collector. One of its most striking pages is this precise month-by-month comparison of US Saturn sales to PlayStation. It paints a dismal picture of Sega's sudden surprise launch. At E3, Tom Kalinske told reporters, they did the surprise launch because Sega fans apparently imported Japanese Saturns to get the console sooner. That, and they wanted a head start on Sony. Nowadays, Kolinsky says Sega of Japan forced him to launch Saturn early. Kolinsky told us there weren't enough games at launch. Evidently, there weren't enough consoles either. This Business Wire article shows a gradual, staggered rollout to the major regions of the US, since they didn't have enough consoles manufactured to ship everywhere at once. So even though it launched in May, people in, say, Richmond, Virginia, had to wait until August. How did this go sales-wise? Now we know. Nearly 20,000 Saturns sold in May, 18,000 in June, all the way down to 10,000 by July.
License revoked. Driving without insurance.
September rolls around. The PlayStation launches $100 cheaper. In just 1 month, it outsells Saturn's total US sales to date. Sega drops their price, later matching $299. Yet they wouldn't pick things up until the holiday shopping season. Cumulative 1995 sales, a far cry from Sony. Sega couldn't reach 250,000. Sony soared past 500,000. If Sega wants to recover from this defeat in 1996, they better have some good games. Though its current games are not selling very well. The documents reveal an incomplete list of Saturn games and how they sold by the end of 1995. Many third-party games are not shown, so we don't know how well Corpse Killer sold, for example.
Feast your eyes on it raw. It was bound for Yucatan from Louis Quince's bodacious mistress when it ran afoul of Eddie Teach, that's Blackbeard, you know. This went down about 1700, but they didn't have Hummers then, so who cares, huh?
1995's top seller is Daytona USA, in at 89,000 copies.
Welcome to Victory Lane. You made it.
Virtua Fighter 2 sold 65,000, and Pebble Beach Golf Links is in at 23,000.
Don't give up too early. Pebble's a challenge for all of us.
On the far lower end, Cyber Speedway pushed just 8,000, and Gen War is tragically sitting at the bottom with a measly 4,000 sold. Sega Rally is in the middle at 42,000. The documents later call this a slacker title, not selling as well as they hoped. Keep in mind, they had Sega of Japan rush out an incomplete version of Rally in North America just so they could release it in time for the holiday season. While 42,000 isn't bad, this is likely not what they hoped for. As of April 3rd, they had a goal to sell 139,000 copies of Rally, the second highest Saturn software sales goal for the fiscal year. Mysteria Realms of Lore is marked as just selling 0 copies, but people did buy it according to Usenet posts. It had to get recalled and renamed to Blazing Heroes after a copyright dispute with the owner of Dungeons & Dragons. So Sega likely marked it with 0 to just cover their butts. RPGs would soon become an important genre for the 5th gen in North America, and just by the looks of this data alone, Sega basically doesn't have any. You will soon see how even the top sellers on this list pale in comparison to the competition.
At the time, we really needed to do something. You know, we needed to offer better value and try to get more players onto the system.
The former Mattel man scribes an interesting email to his staff. Subject line: Saturn success in Japan. He writes about visiting 10 game stores in Japan, mostly Akihabara. He says in all of them, Saturns are sold out and there are stacks of unsold PlayStations. Crowds of teens and college kids clamoring over Sega's console and games. He says it was not unusual to see small stores stock 40 to 50 copies of Spy and VF2, still selling them quickly. We are killing Sony, he says. I wish I could get all our staff, salespeople, retailers, analysts, media to see and understand what's happening in Japan. How do we show that at E3? This is the big question which this April 1996 document attempts to answer. In it lies a roadmap for Sega of America, outlined within this list of goals on page 136. The first, carve unique Sega positioning by streamlining consumer messages, fend off competitive efforts from Sony and Nintendo. They want to fend off Nintendo and Sony with their outstanding first-party games and arcade ports. Several times, they list Knights and Sonic as key titles for getting Saturn to stand out in the West. Getting the arcade to your home is a big Sega selling point through the mid-90s. By now, they already have 4 Saturn controller peripherals meant to emulate the arcade experience, bringing home fighters, racers, light gun shooters, and efforts to make use of the mission stick. Yet they're still struggling to get Sonic. To this day, Kalinsky laments the fact that SOA launched Saturn without the furry mascot.
We were told what we could have, and in large part, and so we didn't have a choice. I mean, we didn't even have Sonic, for God's sake, initially, and that was a huge mistake.
So that all come from Japan, or like did they tell you, hey, produce this software, don't produce this software? Is that basically what that was like?
Basically, that's what happened. Yeah.
So, as of 1996, they're working on it. Long before the surprise launch, SOA tried getting Real-Time Associates to make a Sonic game, but Sega of Japan said no, so they made Bug instead. Good from a marketing standpoint, now we have another first-party mascot, but they still longed for the blue blur. Sonic Team is instead working on a totally different game called Knights, so long story short, the US-based Sega Technical Institute is starting work on what we now know as Sonic Extreme. As of this document, they're in the middle of developing Sonic Extreme, and SOA really wants it to make a dominant appearance at E3. The document lists issues with this game, saying they have to manage timeline aggressively and must release on November 8th. They also need it to be A++ quality. They're not necessarily saying it's bad, but this is all listed under issues. Sega says they must ensure STI meets the deadline without the game sucking. They're also still figuring out its name. SOA estimates Sonic will make them more than $12 million in 1996. It's their second highest estimate for Saturn software. Across the roaring Pacific, Sonic's A-Team is making a totally new first-party Saturn game. Naoto Oshima and Yuji Naka are trading in the Hedgehog for a mid-90s non-binary icon. They wanted to make a game about taking flight, about dreams, anxiety, and magic. So they made Knights. This psychedelic experience is often hailed as one of the Saturn's greatest titles by those who don't get motion sickness from its unorthodox gameplay. It's set for release in Japan just after E3 and due in the States later in the summer. But SOA has one big concern about Knights. They think Knights is for babies. Though SOA estimates nearly 10 million in sales, recognizing its high potential. They list issues for this one, saying game targets very young audience. Sega is known for marketing to older kids, teens, and younger adults. They want to put in game modifications needed for the US market. This is still kinda normal. We've seen it happen before.
Did you know that Super Mario Bros. 2 Doki Doki Panic, while this version is...
I reached out to Knights expert Digi Valentine to ask if any changes were made between the two versions. As far as he can tell, few changes, if any. In the Japanese version, the main antagonist wants to destroy Nightopia so they can rule the night dimension. In the American and European versions, the antagonist's motivation goes as far as wanting to rise up out of subconsciousness and into the real world. But these changes are only discussed in the manuals. What goes on in-game is pretty much the same. Knights is also releasing alongside the upcoming analog controller, and the timing for both is apparently cutting it close. Their second goal: align all product messages against perceived weaknesses. Former Sega exec Shoichiro Irimajiri revealed what went on inside Sega's walls in the mid-90s at a recent lecture, later translated by Mega Drive Shock. When he joined Sega in 1993, he said their 16-bit Mega Drive was in third place in Japan. He says there was a lot of talk about how their next-generation console needs to bring something new, like 3D graphics. But there were also other staffers wanting to make an extremely good 2D console. With opinions split, they decided to make an excellent 2D machine that can do some 3D. It didn't take long for Sony to reveal the awesome power of PlayStation, pumping out polygons per second at a comparable rate to some of Sega's arcade games. Ide Majidi recalls a huge debate within Sega on if they should boost Saturn's 3D so it can handle games like Virtua Fighter. He said the lone CPU couldn't handle it. They considered adding yet another graphics chip, but instead decided to lob on a second CPU. Thus, Saturn has two SH2s. Many early Saturn devs, including first party, saw Saturn as having a 2D console foundation.
3D のマシンではないのに、そのポリゴンのマシンではなくて、スプライトのマシンで 3D を作るっていう、そんなことをさせた会社がちょっとどうかしてるんだと思うんですけど、ゲーム機としては非常に良いじゃないですかね。スプライトゲーム作ったこと一度もないですけど、サターンで。ただ、奇妙なことを、当時もやっていたなと思っていて、世界中で今 3D のゲーム作ってる人、ものすごい数の人いると思うんですけど、スプライトマシンで 3D ゲームを作ったっていうのはすごく数少ないんじゃないかと思うんですね。この長いゲームの歴史の中で。
Unlike Japan, the Mega Drive, or Genesis, was actually doing well in Sega of America. It's competing well against Nintendo, squeaking above the SNES in 1993. Naturally, Sega of America wants to keep up this momentum with the 16-bit market, and as Ide Majidi says, the execs in Japan agreed. Ide Majidi flies to America. Kolinsky and Joe Miller tell him there's no way they can abandon the Genesis quite yet. So in 1994, both arms of the company chose to release Saturn in Japan and the mostly American-made 32X in North America. At the lecture, Ide Majidi said, quote, "We would split the markets that way. The Saturn's American release would be postponed for a year. That's the plan that was eventually agreed upon. It turned out to be a huge strategic blunder, and it would cost us heavily until the very end. The American third parties that were counting on the next generation hardware were thrown into great confusion, and they ended up going to the PlayStation. They didn't continue on to the Saturn."
Welcome to the world of doom, a hellish nightmare for the more real, the more intense world of Genesis 32X.
The leaked document has several pages going over inventory reports at Sega of America's warehouses, showing us just how many copies of games and boxes of hardware they had sitting around, unsold. As of April 1996, Sega had just over 400,000 32X consoles on hand, sitting in the warehouse. Of those units, 0 are being ordered by retailers, meaning no store in the entire country wants Sega to ship them any of the more than 400,000 32X consoles. Looking at games, there are, in total, a hair over 623,000 32X games on hand, and just 84 of those copies are being sent to stores in the next 2 weeks. That's nearly 500,000 32X consoles and more than 500,000 games, rotting. The document has several pages going over this 32X panic. Sell in means what Sega sold to stores, and sell through is what stores sell to customers. This page spells out, few stores are ordering any 32X product. Slashing the price in half to $80 did not work. The console is dead. They go over next steps, which include experimenting with a $50 or even $30 price point for the 32X console, a massive price drop. They're also actively looking into the scrap value of the 400,000 units on hand. It is said the SH2 processors in those leftover 32X consoles were recycled to manufacture Sega Picture Magics. If you open up the two devices and compare, the entire 32X board is inside the Picture Magic units, hooked into a stripped-down Mega Drive board. Stopgaps to the Saturn would later become drawing tablets.
When I wanna be happy, when my eyes are gray, I always have my 32X to fill my day. Not only are the new games really cool to play, they're a challenge.
With 32X, the sound is explosive.
This attempt to extend the life of the Genesis became a massive distraction for Sega of America. It allowed Sony to strike while the iron was hot, improving upon their first dev kits after buying Psygnosis. This also meant they bought SN Systems. The results of this deal were high-quality dev kits that snagged third-party devs early on, allowing them to more easily create 3D games. Sega's kits, while still standard for the industry, did not make 3D easy. Partly thanks to this, PlayStation's early 3D games looked better than most of Saturn's early 3D games. They were just easier to make. But thanks to some valiant first-party efforts and the creation of the Sega Graphics Library dev kits in Japan, Saturn enters summer of 1996 with outstanding-looking titles like Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally, Virtua Cop, and Panzer Dragoon Zwei. The emails from Tom K. in this document specifically call out VF2 and Zwei as a means to reposition Saturn as a technically capable gaming machine. They can be used for this goal to, quote, align all product messages against perceived weaknesses. The document shows storyboards for a couple of Sega commercials that later saw the light of day. This one starts at an airport with two pilots. They're playing Virtua Fighter 2 on a flight status monitor, as these two weird-looking dudes watch on. A frustrated stewardess comes up and says, "Come on guys, everyone's on board, let's go." More gameplay, voiceover brags about the Saturn, and it ends with a bald dude flying the plane shouting, "Sega!" In the page before, we see an email from Tom Kalinske, seemingly bothered by this storyboard. First, the $249 price drop must be mentioned, and we see handwriting scrawled on the storyboards with ideas on how to do this. Kalinske wants more focus on gameplay footage, and to include Zwei. He also says, "When did we decide on Hare Krishna cult members? Who in our audience identifies with them? They might be good for attention humor, but not for selling product." So how did the marketeers do?
The white zone, attention. This is the final boarding call for flight 207. Only Sega Saturn has three 32-bit processors.
Hey guys, that's our flight. We've got to go.
Three processors mean better gameplay.
Come on, you guys, everyone's on board.
Sony PlayStation only has one.
If you won't fly the plane, then I'll find someone who will.
Sega Saturn, now only $249 for unlimited action and the coolest games.
Do you hear me?
When you've got Sega Saturn, nothing else matters.
Sega!
Yeah, this was defo some pre-Y2K nonsense. We can see Zwei was never included, just VF2. There does appear to be more gameplay footage, and the cult members are still present. Another storyboard appears. It's DEF CON 5 at NORAD, but one of the operators is busy playing Panzer Dragoon. The general yells at him, but he's too focused on the quads to care about global disaster. Cut to a cockroach and nuclear rubble yelling, "Sega!"
People, this is not a test. We are at DEF CON 5. Alpha Sector. Check. Tango Sector. Check. Delta Sector.
Only Sega Saturn has three 32-bit processors.
Delta Sector.
Three processors mean better gameplay.
Delta Sector, you hear me?
Sony PlayStation only has one.
10 seconds. 3, 2, 1.
When you've got Sega Saturn, nothing else matters.
Sega!
We can see they wised up, using Zwei footage instead of the first Panzer game. Ads like these play into the next goal: conduct comprehensive consumer/gamer campaigns for key titles/themes. They go over specific marketing goals on page 55. The first, and perhaps biggest, is to focus efforts on closing the perceived technology gap between Saturn and Sony, as well as communicating the reduced price. Yes, that's right, they cut the price yet again. They break down upcoming games in specific seasons, with nights set for back to school. It released in late August of 1996, so for much of America, this goal was met. They want October to be fighting game month, and this is when Fighting Vipers came out. Sonic will come out in November, and more arcade games around the holiday season. They also want to hammer on the sports branding, put more demo kiosks in stores, and keep working with GameWorks entertainment centers. Problem is, on the next page, It shows their marketing budget went down by a whopping 40%. If they cannot spend much on advertising these, we can at least hope the games will be good enough to speak for themselves. Through 1995, Saturn couldn't seem to get a decent football game. No, Mike, QB Attack doesn't count. NFL games are a big reason why the Genesis became a winning console in North America. These documents note that audience as being crucial for Saturn, self-aware with the fact that they still have yet to get a good football game on the console. One page compares the 1995 sales of two specific sports games, World Series Baseball on Saturn and NFL Game Day on PlayStation. We can see Sony's football game roughly quadrupled the sales of World Series Baseball. They note, the NFL game came out during football season, while World Series Baseball missed the diamond-bound broadcasts. That 200,000 sales figure for what isn't even a headliner PlayStation game more than doubled Saturn's best sellers. This is a mere taste of how much Sony is just crushing Sega in North America. The good news, Microprose is willing to fill this football gap. The bad news, their football game f***ing sucks. Several pages list grave concerns about this third-party sports project. They have a whole list of upcoming Saturn sports games, bullet pointing their issues and potential solutions. For Microprose NFL, Sega's issues with the game include extremely low quality. It's also 6 months late. Solutions? Kill title or sell to third party. It would appear this specific project was cancelled. Whatever NFL game they do wind up with, SOA estimates it would make them $12.6 million in 1996, narrowly beating Sonic for their highest estimate for the fiscal year. They talk about the Manx TT port not having a developer yet, and baseball games on track to ship too late. On page 65, they talk about the role of sports, saying, sports drove Sega Genesis' success. Sports is now a liability on Saturn. Though it is a first-party publisher, Sega Sports relied on third-party developers to get the job done. They compare the percentage of all sports games under Sega in 1994, and at 27%. This share drops to 19% in 1995. It also shows nearly 2/3 of all 95 sports games are on PlayStation. Release deadlines and goals for arcade ports and fighters are laid out in some of these sections. Based on release date research from me and Pimpo, it appears they made par on some, while missing others by a few weeks or even months. One really interesting game mentioned a few times is Star Wars Alien Hive. They don't say much about what it is, but hope to have it out by the end of 1996 or start of 97. It never came out. Though nowadays, a leaked build of something called Star Wars Rebel Strike can be found online. It has the player control a speeder bike on what appears to be Endor, blasting away at bad guys and vegetation. Star Wars Alien Hive could have been this project, or perhaps something else entirely. Either way, a shame it never came out. Saturn never got a Star Wars game at all. If it did, Sega thinks it could have made $3.5 million. The documents go over some of their lesser celebrated titles with first-party ties. Part of Goal 4, support other titles with focused efforts as appropriate. NBA action is being made by Gray Matter, the team that made the terrible NHL All-Star Hockey.
Hello.
NBA action is using the same engine as NHL, which Sega labels poorly designed. It also, quote, does not meet Sega Sports quality standards. PlayStation's basketball game is apparently very good. Solutions: delay the game till November and send developers from Sega to help Gray Matter. They were able to release it on June 5th, the first day of the NBA Finals that year. Sega thinks it could make $2 million. It reviewed okay. Not sure how it sold. It's strange that as of April, they were toying with the idea of sending them development help, but the game came out 2 months after this, meaning the game must have been finished about a month from this writing. That's to allow time to print copies and ship them out. So whatever help was provided must not have been much. SOA is making a push to appeal to puzzle fans with Baku Baku. They're planning to release it across Saturn, Game Gear, and PC. They're even listing it as a candidate for being compatible with the Saturn's upcoming online peripheral. They think it will make close to $1.5 million. Mr. Bones, on the other hand, $3.5 million.
Didn't I used to have more skin on these bones? Man, you know I got the blues.
They planned to have it out by August or September, but it would wind up waiting until October.
Fun fact!
Mr. Bones' voice actor is very, very active on YouTube.
Sword does not hit the floor. Recover, keep going. All right, let's get for it. What are you doing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom.
Have loved so many ways.
Bug 2 is forecast to make nearly $4 million. They want it out in November, but it wouldn't hit until the following month. So we can say this goal, while small, was met, so to speak. Perhaps more important than these B-list first-party games is securing key third parties for Goal 5. Support key third-party efforts to emphasize Saturn software. Shoichiro Irimajiri spoke about Sega's third-party problem at the recent lecture. He joined Sega right when Sony unveiled the 3D power of PlayStation. Sony had just finished early prototype dev hardware and sent it out to third parties. Irimajiri says as a result, many third parties shifted to 3D games, abandoning 2D. In America, they collectively chose to keep the Genesis afloat since, at the time, it had outstanding third-party support. Turns out, the Americans were also switching to 3D, hopping on PlayStation early. We can see on release calendars, third parties have nearly stopped supporting Genesis. By the look of this sports game release calendar, it appears Saturn amassed enough support to seemingly outdo PlayStation's third-party sports schedule, but the list appears incomplete, and many of those Saturn games would later get cancelled. Sports aside, one of Sega's key goals is to support all key third-party titles. They set a goal to secure a minimum of 5 exclusive third-party Saturn games among other multi-platform titles. We get a glimpse of this forecast on page 262. As of early 1996, Sega thought these third-party games would be exclusive to Saturn: Command & Conquer, The Elder Scrolls, F1 Challenge, Night Warriors, Shining Wisdom, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and penciled in are Mr. Bones, Sacred Pools, and 3 Dirty Dwarves. Command & Conquer would later come out for both of Saturn's chief competitors, while the Elder Scrolls port and Sacred Pools were cancelled. Pools was a nearly $3 million adult FMV game paid for by Sega. Builds of the game later leaked, including a PlayStation port. So this Sega-funded exclusive got onto the rival console, then it got cancelled. Not much is known about the Elder Scrolls Arena port, how far Bethesda got, or what made them stop. But at one point in 1996, Elder Scrolls was going to be an exclusive Saturn port. The page shows these 5 games as having limited exclusivity, including Heart of Darkness. Not based on the novel by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness is a wild and cinematic 2D platformer. In the game's early days, Saturn was supposed to get the first port, and for a limited amount of time, be the only console to have it. They seemed to be banking on it for 1996, estimating $2.6 million in gross sales, retailing at $50. But in the document, Sega says they still need more information about it. They seem to be unsure when it will come out, hoping to show it off at E3 this year, then release it sometime this summer. Sega did snag it for the E3 show floor, but after that, it left Saturn's orbit for good, getting cancelled, and eventually released on PS1. A build of the Saturn port did leak to Hidden Palace. no need to worry about this too much, since E3 goers can see Saturn is finally getting its very own Sonic game. I mean, that'd be a total blunder if they never put a proper Sonic game on Saturn, am I right, gamers? In Goal 6, Sega will come to terms with its slashed marketing budget, extend sampling of product beyond FY1996 limitations to broaden media exposure on Saturn. Going into this chart wall, we know the total budget was cut by 40%. We can see Saturn is getting the highest amount of ad money for the upcoming fiscal year, in at more than $9 million. Even though American buyers are not biting on 16-bit nearly as hard as they were before, SOA is still going to spend about $5 million on Genesis ads. Game Gear is at a measly $500,000, and the newly released Nomad, just $250,000. We can see another $9 million being put aside for sports, presumably Sega sports video games. They break down ad budgets for specific Genesis games, like $123,000 for Vector Man 2, $175,000 for the cancelled X-Women, and a whopping $4.3 million for Sonic 3D Blast. World Series Baseball 95 for the Genesis, not to be confused with World Series Baseball, will get more than $2 million in ads. Close to the same amount will be spent on World Series Baseball 2 for the Saturn. Not to be confused with... never mind. Some of the games in these columns are getting no ads, just factoring in the costs of packaging. No ads at all for these 32X games. The Sega Nomad is in a similar boat. This battery-hungry portable Genesis released half a year before this document. It'll get no TV ads, no print or radio ads, just appearances at trade shows and some posters. In an email to other higher-ups, Kolinsky asks if we should have made a bigger deal about the Nomad, seeming to regret its lackluster marketing efforts. Len Ciceretto replied, saying they evaluated their limited marketing budget and decided the Nomad was not the place to put the money. Quote, "We have almost no Genesis media this year, and I wouldn't want to spend the little we have on this product during this time period. Tom, you're going to hear this a lot this year, so you need to realize, when we cut every corner, there isn't much left." Elric & Lavage, a marketing research firm, carried out a survey of Sega Saturn's consumer image compared to that of the PlayStation. They asked the people questions like if they think the console uses the most advanced technology. Does it offer the new gaming experience? Are the graphics good? Are the games fun? Results are posted on page 147. We can see PlayStation winning every single category with a wide margin on most advanced tech and better than other systems. Part of Sega's efforts to close this image gap has to do with demo kiosks in stores. Anyone who didn't grow up playing games on a fucking iPad knows what these are. You can still feel the neck pain, craning up at the sky-high CRT in the back of a big box store. The document calls them interactives over on page 203. This lays out how many Saturn and PlayStation interactives exist within these American retailers. We can see KB Toys has no Saturn kiosks. You may remember Kolinsky saying in interviews, Saturn's surprise launch torched Sega's bridge with KB. Many of the other stores tend to favor Sony, though Toys R Us has the same amount of kiosks for both. Circuit City seems to favor Saturn, with 350 kiosks, and only 100 for PlayStation. Though Walmart is a critical weak spot for Sega here, with no Saturn kiosks, and more than 2,000 PlayStation stands. As many of you know, Walmart is a major US retailer, so for Sega to have no hands-on demos here is a big problem. In total, Sega needs to add about 4,500 Saturn interactives to be on par with Sony. Getting this done means they have to convince retailers to sell Saturns at all. Across all platforms, the video game industry to this point is known to have slim profit margins for retailers. This means the amount of money a store makes for selling something. Kolinsky notes in an email on page 286, many retailers are leaving the video game business because of the slim margins. An SOJ exec echoes the sentiment, saying Nintendo told third parties their doors decreased to 10,000 from 20,000. Retail margins are on page 46. When a store sells a Saturn in April of 1996, they get a 6% cut. Genesis and Game Gear provide an 8% margin, while Pico deals a whopping 20% profit. Doing the math, stores make more dollars selling Picos than they do selling Saturns. While odd, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means stores have a great incentive to sell Picos. Sega's plan is to increase Saturn retail margins, doing more pack-in game deals. It will be an uphill battle, something Kolinsky seems to be very worried about. The businessman wonders what long-term ripple effects will hit the industry. Quote, "If the video game industry does not find a way of increasing retailer margins, we will soon be left with only specialty store distribution. In the past year, we've seen many retailers exit the business, i.e. Macy's, Shopko, Hills, Kohl's, etc. More will this year if margin is not increased. The toy industry went through this several years ago and had to make changes to address this." A former Babbage's store employee wrote this article about his time at the store. He was there for the big 3 console launches of the 5th gen. While they were preparing for a September 1995 Saturn launch, Sega drop-shipped Saturns to his Houston store the morning of May 11th, right before announcing the surprise launch. They sold well initially, but the flame doused fast, with many Saturn consoles in the back of their store. Months later, when the PlayStation came out, they couldn't seem to stock enough. Those things just kept flying off the shelves. Saturn was still selling more than the 3DO and Jaguar, but a far cry from Sony's sudden success.
So anyway, I'm playing jet moto, right? And I'm riding on this jet motorcycle, and I'm hurtling through different terrains, snow, concrete, ocean, jungle. I mean, when you get that kind of power between your legs, you don't know what to expect. Anything could happen.
So, if Sega wants to pick things up, they better make a big impression at E3 and beyond. Their next goal: use E3 as a springboard for fall. Sega was poised to bring something to the table that would send Saturn deep into the future. We're talking something that Sony wouldn't figure out until midway through the PS2's life cycle. Unless you count Phantasy Star, it's something Nintendo wouldn't even bother messing around with for 2 entire console generations: online play. The document reveals much of the discussion between SOA and SOJ about the Saturn Netlink adapter. They were thinking about 4 different possibilities. A Netlink cartridge at 14.4K BPS, which might not work for American consumers. A cartridge at 28.8K. The Sega Pluto. And a unit that connects to the back of the console. The Sega Pluto is a prototype Saturn console with both a hard drive and a Netlink modem built into the machine. They were going to sell it at around $500. It ultimately never came out, though prototypes have since been sold out in the wild. One of them is on a never-ending vacation around the world. The 2 arms of Sega eventually decided to go with the cartridge-based Netlink peripheral. The documents show emails between SOA and SOJ going back and forth on how to show off Netlink at E3. SOJ is telling the Americans they won't be able to ship the Netlink out west until the fall, and this conflicts with some marketing plans that show the Saturn being online earlier in the year. By Frankensteining together hardware from different regions, they got a Netlink demo ready for E3. You can browse the internet with this thing and play Netlink-compatible games with friends across the continent.
One of the top dogs from Sega, Michael Rivero, has been kind enough to stop by and give us the inside scoop to this Netlink. What's up with this?
It's probably one of the coolest things we've ever done. A lot of people have talked about this network access device, this network computer that was going to retail for $500. The big guys have been talking about it, but it took a game company, it took Sega to make it happen. The Sega Saturn Netlink will retail for under $450, and it'll give people all over the world the ability to access the internet.
Well, wait a second. So if I don't have a computer, will I be able to access the internet?
Absolutely. You'll be able to do everything you can do on a computer, plus something that you can't do right now for under $2,000, and that's play games over the internet.
Wow, so wait, let me get this straight. So I'll be able to play games with my little brother back east?
Absolutely.
Living out here?
Yeah, you'll be able to play games with your little brother back east. You'll be able to play games with people all across in Europe and Asia. It's that kind of system.
Throughout this document, they list several games as getting potential Netlink releases, though most of them would not pan out. By the end of the console lifespan, only 5 American Saturn games could use the Netlink, but by the looks of the doc, more were slated for internet play. This includes Baku Baku, Gun Griffin, The Cancelled Descent, Command & Conquer, and Duke Nukem 3D. They would make this typo more than once. There was also a Sega of Japan guy that called it Crash Bandicoot, but moving on. One of their software strategies for the following fiscal year was to develop between 6 and 8 internet-compatible games, but they would not succeed at this. Many of the games shown and advertised at E3 and others revealed in this PDF would hit the chopping block. After looking through the document, we found out it lists at least 80 American Saturn releases that would later get canceled. Some only came out in Japan, some only on other platforms, and some never came out on anything at all. We already talked about a few heavy-hitter cancellations like Heart of Darkness, Elder Scrolls, and Star Wars. In the documents, there are multiple game release calendars showing which games are coming out in what month. They include titles like Star Control 3, Alien vs. Predator, The Descent series, Grand Theft Auto, Lethal Enforcers, Rayman 2, Syndicate Wars, Wing Commander 4, Devil Summoner, Toga King 2, Lunar the Silver Star, Riglord Saga 2, Terra Fantastica, Destruction Derby, Discworld, Crazy Ivan, Myst 2, Swagman, Eternal Champions, Freerunner, Into the Shadows, NFL Jam, Vector Man, Shenmue, and Virtua Fighter 3, all canceled. I should note, the documents also list Virtua Cop 3 and Virtualon 2, but these are likely predictions from Sega management, since the development timelines for those two just don't add up here. Still, so many could have beens. So many games that could have maybe lifted up Saturn as a decent competitor, all left in the dust. But hey, at least Sonic is coming out on Saturn in November of 1996. That's right around the holiday season, key for conducting special efforts for key audiences. PR initiatives are set up for the 1996 holiday season for just about everything the Saturn has to offer. This includes Sonic, the Internet Peripheral, Nights, arcade ports, and sports games, all after the Saturn's price drops to just $200. They will also be competing with the Nintendo 64, poised to become an ultimate gaming machine according to Kalinsky. Before all that, they talk about advertising Sega at key events like Lollapalooza, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and Gamers Day. That's a press-exclusive event where Sega invites magazine writers, reporters, and third-party devs to take a look at Sega's hottest upcoming games. They included Crazy Ivan at the event, which was a mistake.
He's faster than the speed of sound, that's why they call him Sonic 3D Blast. Deal with it, he is the coolest, but when it comes to video game characters, dude, he's the hottest.
This document also shows us poorly scanned black and white Sega ads on things like cereal boxes. A lot of these are just kind of funny to look at. Sonic is all over these pieces of cardboard, proudly roaring the battle cries of Game Gear, Genesis, and Saturn. Part of this balanced breakfast.
The big day is dawning at Toys R Us, so hurry in the day after Thanksgiving for our early bird specials.
They have to get a lot of these games out by or before Black Friday, which is in late November. While many Sega of Japan localizations were at risk of not making it, SOA was able to light fires under some butts and get them out in time for Black Friday, or at least close enough. Though some did not make it in time or at all, like Riglord Saga 2, and Manx TT Superbike didn't make it in time. That's one of the SOJ AM stars they were not able to showcase in the US until the middle of 1997, bleeding into the next goal, showcase SOJ AM stars to extend coverage in US. Though, I should say, this goal was mostly met. Many of Sega's incredible first-party Saturn games did make it to the US, and even hit the scene before the 96 holidays. Problem is, while they seemingly have this goal to showcase the SOJ AM stars, SOA is still distracted by trying to keep the Sega Genesis alive. These documents show it is very much not alive. We spoke about their 32X inventory problems. The pages show inventory for all their active platforms, and the outlook is less than pretty. Remember, when looking at these, net on hand is how many copies Sega has in warehouses. This column is the amount ordered by stores for the next 2 weeks, and this column for the amount ordered over the next 44 days. For most games, there is an astronomical amount on hand, with a small fraction being ordered, if at all. Sonic & Knuckles. SOA has 250,000 copies. None of them are being ordered. Vector Man, 123,000 copies. Only 85 are being ordered by retailers. Garfield, 85,000 copies. 25 being ordered. That's 25 flat. NFL 95, 113,000 copies. None ordered. The other football games are in a similar situation, showing even the coveted sports games are not pushing Genesis units. Adding up all these games in total, 1.4 million copies of Genesis games are in the warehouse, and they are rotting. Of their 135,000 Genesis consoles on hand, only 1/10 of them are being requested by stores. Some of the newer games coming out, like Experts, are in low demand. No copies are on hand since it doesn't come out for another month, but only about 8,000 copies are being requested. It's early 1996, and the Sega Genesis is dead. Adding insult to critical injury, they want to sell nearly 500,000 3-button Genesis controllers, even though the newer games use 6. Despite this steep and unreasonable goal, they only have 74 3-button controllers on hand. Optics are just as dismal for the Game Gear, a little more than 300,000 consoles on hand, and about 9% of them are being ordered. Close to 1 million total Game Gear games in the warehouse, and they too are rotting. They have more than 100,000 copies of Sonic Chaos. None are being ordered. Even the profitable Pico is going through the same problem. 131,000 Picos in the warehouse. They are rotting. Same story for the 180,000 Pico games. The Sega CD, while relatively successful in its heyday, is now dead. About 100,000 consoles with 0 orders. And of the roughly 117,000 total games, 0.2% are being ordered. Saturn orders are not in as bad of a situation, but there are still many games where they have way more copies than orders. Still, a good percentage of them are in some kind of demand. This continued romance with the Genesis is troubling. Release calendars show heavy-hitting titles either just came out or will come out later this year. SOA is treating it like people still want 16-bit action. They don't. This appears to disregard the dismal amount of orders for products they over-manufactured. It disregards the insane share of the consumer base that has moved on to the PlayStation, even dwarfing Sega's equivalent next-gen console in short order. 16-bit sales across all platforms are already in a sharp decline. In Sega's FY1998 report for shareholders, they say straight up, Sega also took aggressive steps during the year to dispose of unprofitable assets, including writing off inventories in preparation for the launch of the company's new home video game console, Dreamcast. So, much of this unsold stock was liquidated. It seems likely this was part of the Majesco deal. That's the company that published late-end Genesis and Game Gear games in the late 90s. One question this begs: why do they have so many goddamn copies of games that have no demand? Shoichiro Irimajiri seemingly answers this question. At his recent lecture, he cited a huge problem specific to the American video game market. Huge retailers like Toys R Us and Walmart would request a huge quantity of stock at first, and if it didn't sell within a certain period, they would make Sega buy it all back. The retailers required companies like Sega to have an extraordinarily large amount of stock on hand so they can replenish when items sell out. Quote from Irimajiri. SOA's posted profits in 1993, for example, were all washed away because it had to take extraordinary losses on return stock later on. Those extraordinary losses came to $100 million or $200 million at a time. He gives an example, saying the retailers required SOA to have 500,000 Genesis consoles on hand to replenish stock, or they would refuse to do business with Sega. SOA had an excess of inventory that would all be sold at once, bringing in a huge amount of revenue. Then all that inventory would come back from retailers later on, and SOA would take a huge loss. With the Genesis, all of those losses started to appear in 1994, 95, and 96. If you added up all the losses, the number would be astronomical. When we looked at the numbers carefully, even though SOA had a reputation for earning so much money, it turned out they weren't earning much at all. We decided we had to change things, and that necessitated reducing the size of the company. According to Mr. Idimaji's lecture, in 1995, Sega of Japan gave Tom Kalinske 1 year to restructure Sega of America. Then, in 1996, right around the time of this leaked document, they found he did not progress at all. Sega of Japan asked Tom Kalinske to resign. From that moment forth, Idimaji was tasked with restructuring SOA. This hand-drawn map of Sega's 1996 E3 booth accurately shows the floor they would wind up laying out for real. Nights into Dreams was prominently displayed, as was the Saturn's next Sonic game, Sonic X-treme, due out in November of this year. Demos of the game were playable at E3. It sure looks promising, poised to make Sega more than $12 million. November came, and the monkey paw curled. Sonic X-treme was in development hell, and a port of the 16-bit Sonic 3D Blast was released instead.
Sonic 3D Blast! Deal with it!
It may be impossible to estimate how many millions of dollars were lost by Sega of America throughout the mid-90s. Based on Idimaji's recount of events and the occasional numbered reports in various documents, they likely lost the empire hundreds of millions of dollars. I think it would be unwise to say the two branches were at odds with each other. This is a common myth. The 32X, while spearheaded by SOA, was a team effort idea. And after all, both branches, both sides of the ocean, want each other to make money. They want each other to be successful. Sega founder David Rosen once spoke about the communication problem, saying, quote, "After the Genesis, Sega of America was interested in developing peripherals, while Sega of Japan wanted to move on. It wasn't necessarily a friction, but there was a lot of going back and forth, helping to resolve issues with the ultimate aim of achieving what both arms of the company wanted." Shunichi Nakamura recently wrote about SOA's financial woes in Nikkei, translated by Mega Drive Shock. The branches used to calculate their earnings and inventory independently. Nakamura says by the time they started consolidating their accounting, it was too late. He said both Sega of America and Sega of Europe accumulated a large amount of unsold stock. If there's one thing I hope you take away from all this, Sega's downfall was caused by a large number of issues. So often we hear people say, "Oh, piracy on the Dreamcast killed Sega," or "Oh, the Dreamcast not having a DVD drive killed Sega." No. The Dreamcast was a fine machine with capable 3D graphics. It had flaws, and it did not sell well enough to pull Sega out of the hole. That hole was pretty deep. They lost a ton of money in the years leading up to 6th gen. We cannot point to just one thing and say, this is what killed Sega. The death of the Blue Giant is way more complex. So many factors played into their hardware biz exit. Really, it all boils down to this. They ran out of money. The process of losing money dates back far before the Dreamcast, and some of it was out of Sega's control. They did make critically bad decisions, like creating the 32X, clinging to the Genesis, and botching Saturn's launch. But things like overstocking games were apparent requirements by the American retail industry. Sony striking hot iron while Saturn was still searching for its identity. All the failed hardware collabs, the failed hardware ideas, wasted money on underperforming or canceled products, hundreds of millions of dollars lost in buying back unsold stock. So much went into the ghoulish wounds on Sega's purse. I leave you with this thought. Imagine you're Bernie Stolar. Put yourself in his well-polished dress shoes for just a moment. You're inheriting Sega of America, essentially tasked with fixing the company. you're not much of a gamer, but rather a business person. These are the numbers you see. Saturn instantly killed by its competitor. Dismal sales numbers that are not picking up. Third parties leaving the console, games getting canceled, all while the promising next-gen machine is already in the lab. What would you do? Thanks for watching.
Creative energy, and then you apply it in a business setting, and everybody recognizes that, everybody in the company needs one another. Their job as a company is gotta fall on freezing, and this is gonna happen every time. At the end of any season, you're not gonna be able to go into the playoffs. You get a frequency on, it's fine. Steve, hey, it's Dave. The bug's fixed. It is. Yeah, we're ready to release. And we've all our tick marks on that, we're ready to go. Okay, so good, I'll call marketing right now, and you guys get the paperwork ready? Yeah, we'll get the paperwork done. Awesome. Talk to you soon. Alright, talk to you in a bit. Bye. Dunley, it's me again. Good news today. Yep. Bug's fixed. We're gonna release. Paperwork's on the way. It'll be a go. Alright. You set? Let's do it. Bye.